Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted publicly. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Now I'd like to turn the call over to your host, Michael Simmons, the U.S. Census Bureau.
Thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Simmons, Supervisor in the Economic Management Division of the U.S. Census Bureau. Today, we have several subject matter experts from the State Department, Directorate Defense Trade Controls. Please join the Directorate Defense Trade Controls Office of Defense Trade Controls Policy and IT Modernization Team for an overview of the recently published Open General License Pilot Program, the ITAR reorganization effort, and other upcoming ITAR regulatory changes. The Census team is happy to collaborate with the State Department to provide you this webinar today. Thank you all for joining. We have an informative webinar planned, and I would like to go over a few items before we start. The webinar is being recorded. You will receive the transcript, presentation, and recording as soon as it's available, and it will be posted on the Census Academy and State Department website. The chat will be monitored during this webinar. Please submit your questions to all panelists, and the presenter will address as many questions as possible as time allows. The contact information will be provided for further follow-up as well. Lastly, we value your feedback, so please complete the evaluation form at the end as it assists us in planning future webinars and bringing quality content to our customers. Now let's begin with today's subject matter. I will turn it over to Renee at the State Department.
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to the U.S. Census Bureau for hosting today's webinar. As Michael mentioned, today's webinar is going to be on the topic of the Open General License Pilot Program, the ITAR reorg, Rule 1, and other upcoming rule changes. So I'm Renee Coloris. I'm on the IT modernization team at the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls at the State Department, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Delon Wickrema, who's a Foreign Affairs Officer in the Regulatory and Multilateral Affairs Division, as well as Charlie Liebetrau and Noah Bautista, who also support the IT modernization team. And just a little bit about DDTC. So as many of you probably know, our main mission is ensuring that commercial exports of defense articles and services advance U.S. national security and foreign policy objectives. And so going on to the next slide, we'll talk a bit about the agenda for today before I hand it over to Delon. So Delon's going to be talking about the Open General License Pilot Program, also the ITAR reorg that went live on September 6th, and many probably have seen updates on our website. He'll also talk about other regulations that are in development and reference material. Just a note, please feel free to put a lot of your questions in the chat. We'll have a session at the end where we'll do a Q&A and we'll answer a lot of your questions. And also, this webinar, as many have mentioned, is being recorded and will be posted online. So if you have any colleagues that are having trouble accessing the webinar or were unable to join today, we'll be sharing this recording as well, so they can always check back. But that's a bit about the agenda and some key points. I'm going to hand it over to Delon to kick it off. Over to you, Delon.
Hey, great, Renee, appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Delon Wickrema. I'm a Foreign Affairs Officer in the Director of Defense Trade Controls Office of Policy, as Renee noted, in the Multilateral and Regulatory Affairs Division. Today, as noted, we'll be talking about the new Open General License Pilot Program, the ITAR reorganization effort, and other regulatory actions that are currently in development. One note in advance, while the portion regarding the OGEL is pretty in the weeds, the discussion regarding the ITAR reorganization and other upcoming regulatory actions is broader in nature, just to kind of give you a preview of the lay of the show, so to speak, of today. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the purposes of the OGELs, the relevant statutory and regulatory authority, an overview of OGEL number 1 and number 2's requirements, limitations, and provisos, the recently published FAQs regarding the OGELs, some scenarios that highlight how the OGELs can be used. We will then move on to the ITAR reorganization portion to discuss the issues the reorganization is designed to address, how the initiative will address these issues, and the individual steps of this multi-phase initiative. Finally, we will then discuss some of the other upcoming regulatory actions that DTC is working on before moving on to do some Q&A. And I should also note I've included some reference material regarding these three topics on this second to last slide or one of the last slides of this presentation. So if you're looking for links regarding this information, regarding the OJELs, the ITAR reorg, a lot of the other topics we're going to discuss today, feel free to jump to that slide and you can pull down that the specific documents while we're discussing it. Next slide. Thanks. All right, moving on to the actual Open General License Pilot Program, or OGELs, as we're calling them. So why did DVCC go through all the trouble of creating and implementing this pilot program? Well, besides for our continuous efforts to maintain a modern and agile export framework, this pilot program is really focused on facilitating legitimate defense trade with partners and allies, while denying adversaries access to U.S. sensitive technology. Specifically, the pilot program is focused on increasing operational readiness on one hand, and interoperability of U.S. partners and allies on the other. So those are the two primary goals that we're going to be talking about today. The pilot program is similar in concept to those Open General Licenses administered by Australia, Japan, the United Kingdom, and others, and also in the U.S. regulatory framework that regulates cross-border transactions. You can look at to OFAC in terms of how they usually use OGELs to regulate their equities in cross-border transactions. So very similar concept to other Open General License schemes that are already out there within the United States government and foreign governments. Next slide. So as noted, since we're purposefully going into the details here of this specific pilot program, I thought we could start at the foundation, right? The statutory and regulatory authority utilized to promulgate the OGELs. So first, per ITAR 126.9b, which is now 120.22b, post ITAR reorganization, DATC may create pilot programs for anticipated circumstances for which DATC considers special authorizations appropriate. As noted in both OGELs, DATC issued both OGELs pursuant to this ITAR provision. Second, in terms of what authorizations the OGELs are, well, as noted in both OGELs, they are considered a license, as defined in previously ITAR 120.20, which is now ITAR 120.57a, post September 6th ITAR reorganization. Third, when reviewing the OGELs, you will notice that both leverage the existing Australian and UK approved communities, as described in ITAR 126.16d and 126.17d. which have not changed, as sites are still the same post September 6th. And these two ITAR specific provisions stem from the relevant Senate treaties, the treaty between the government of the United States of America and the government of the Australia concerning defense trade cooperation, and the same treaty separately made with the United Kingdom. Fourth, on a similar note, you will notice that the OGELs are leveraging the pre-existing Canadian Controlled Goods Program and subsequent Canadian registered persons, as defined in ITAR 126.5b. Okay, with that foundation, let's move on to the actual OGELs themselves, specifically OGEL number 1. Next slide. Okay, going back to the overall purposes that we mentioned at the very beginning, OGEL number 1 was designed to facilitate and enable an increase in operational readiness in our partners and allies, specifically by authorizing retransfers within Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom of unclassified defense articles. The approved recipients of such transfers could be the governments of Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom, members of the Australian and United Kingdom approved communities, and Canadian registered persons. Next slide. Now, of course, there are requirements, limitations, and provisos listed in OGEL number 1 that must be complied with for that license to be used. So first, regarding the requirements, the person using the license must inform the new end user and all new consignees that the defense articles are subject to U.S. export laws and regulations, and the related information enumerated in ITAR 123.9b. This is a long-standing requirement that's been in the regulation, so folks should be generally familiar with this particular requirement. Second, the receiver of the defense article must maintain the records as described in the OGEL and make such records available to DATC upon request. Also, the record-keeping requirements as enumerated in the OGEL, very similar to the ones that are currently in currently required under the regulations. So it shouldn't be anything new in terms of unfamiliar language or record-keeping requirements if you're using the OJEL. Third, the person using the license must utilize Open General License Number 1 as the license or other approval number citation in their own records of the transaction. So those are the requirements. Next slide. Now, as you may have already noticed, if you've taken a look at the OJEL, there are other limitations and provisos that must also be adhered to when using OJEL number 1. So first, the defense article being retransferred must have originally been exported pursuant to a license or other approval issued by DDTC under AECA, the Arms Export Control Act, Section 38, or either of the Defense Trade Cooperation Treaties. Okay, so one of the common questions we've had regarding this particular proviso is that why isn't the Canadian exemption specifically listed if the treaties are specified? Well, it goes back to what the underlying statutory authority is for each of the exemptions. So while the AECA provides a statutory authority for the Canadian exemptions, it is the Defense Trade Cooperation Treaties that enable the Australian and UK exemptions to exist. Thus, if we specify the Canadian exemptions here in the particular provision of the OJEL one that we're talking about here, it would have been duplicative because AECA Section 38 is already listed. Okay, so what does that all mean? Everything I just said? Basically, if a defense article was originally exported using Canadian exemptions, you can use OJEL number 1 to facilitate a retransfer of that defense article. Canadian exemptions are still in play here. All right, hopefully that clears up that particular question. The second limitation to note is that OJEL number 1 cannot be used to retransfer defense articles originally exported via an FMS program. Okay, we're just dealing with direct commercial sales here. We're not working into foreign military sales jurisdiction. We're just talking about DCS transfers. The third limitation to note is that OJEL number 1 cannot be used to retransfer any defense article listed on the Missile Technology Control Regime Annex. Any defense article identified as missile technology or MT on the USML and ITAR Part 121. And any defense article that will be used to support the design, development, engineering, manufacture, production, assembly, testing, repair, maintenance, modification, operation, demilitarization, destruction, or processing of a missile, UAV, space launch vehicle, item listed on the MTCR Annex, or item listed as MT on the USML. Apologies, that was read verbatim, but just wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page in terms of what is allowed and what is not allowed, especially when it comes to MTCR related activities and defense articles. And to no surprise, these limitations were included to ensure that the department is fulfilling the United States MTCR obligations for a case-by-case review of such items and support. These are the same obligations that most of our partners and allies and everyone who's adhered to the MTCR agreements must abide by there. So it should be nothing new in terms of what we're talking about there with regards to MTCR. There are also technical data limitations, which limit the retransfer of technical data using OJEL number 1 as a license for the purpose of organizational level, intermediate level, or depot level maintenance, repair, or storage of defense article. So what does that mean though? Well, as you may already know, the ITAR defines such maintenance levels in ITAR 120.45. This was previously ITAR 120.38 before the ITAR reorganization. So if you're not sure what tech data can be used or what tech data can be transferred out of the OJELs, take a look at ITAR 120.45 and there's your answer. There's specific definitions in terms of what technical data we're talking about here. OJEL number 1 also includes value limitations, specifically any major defense equipment as defined in ITAR 120.37, which was previously ITAR 120.8 before the reorganization. So any major defense equipment at $25 million or more and any defense article or service valued at $100 million or more can only use OJEL number 1 if it's being retransferred for the purposes of two purposes. First, maintenance, repair, or overhaul defense services, including the repair of defense articles used in furnishing of such services, if the retransfer will not result in any increase in the military capability of the defense article, or second reason, the temporary retransfer of defense articles for the sole purpose of receiving maintenance, repair, or overhaul. So if you hit that value limitation, There's only 2 carve-outs and both are specified there in the OJEL, so take a look at that. If neither of these 2 carve-outs are met and the value meets that specified threshold, OJEL number 1 cannot be used to retransfer the defense articles. And why are these limitations in place? Well, frankly, in the Arms Export Control Act, Section 3D, there's a congressional notification requirement for transfers over that specific threshold. So we have to make sure that any transfers that are conducted are underneath that value threshold. Okay, so that's the value limitations. Regarding location limitations, the retransfers under OJEL number 1 must take place wholly within the physical territory of Australia, Canada, or the United Kingdom. There is also an end use limitation for defense articles being retransferred. Specifically, it must be for end use by or operation on behalf of the government of Australia, Canada, or the United Kingdom. Finally, Open General License number 1 cannot be utilized by persons to whom a presumption of denial is applied to by DDTC, as described in ITAR 120.16c, which was previously ITAR 120.1c before the reorganization. All right, so that's Open General License number 1. Next slide. Moving on to Open General License number 2. So while number 1 was focused on increasing operational readiness in our partners and allies, Open General License number 2 was focused on that second goal we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, increasing interoperability between our partners and allies. So to further this goal, in contrast to Open General License number 1, which authorizes retransfers, Open General License number 2 authorizes re-exports of unclassified defense articles between or among Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Here, similar to Open General License number 1, the approved recipients of such re-exports could be the governments of Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom, members of the Australian and United Kingdom approved communities, and Canadian registered persons. Next slide. Now, regarding Open General License number 2's requirements, limitations, and provisos, don't worry, I'm not going to go through them proviso by proviso, requirement by requirement, like Open General License 1, since they are the same except for 3 points. These are the 3 differences we can kind of go over today. First, the license or other approval number citation is Open General License number 2, opposed to Open General License number 1. No surprise there. Second, the re-export taking place must be wholly within or between the physical territory of Australia, Canada, or the United Kingdom. And then third, OJEL number 2's end use restriction also allows for the government of the United States to be a possible end user. In contrast, as you may recall, Open General License number 1 does not include the government of the United States as a possible end user. So those are the 3 differences to pull out if you're trying to compare compliance requirements between Open General License 1 and Open General License number 2. Just recall those 3 differences, and that will be, what you can compare and contrast between the 2. Next slide. All right, so now that we have reviewed all the OJEL provisions, there are a couple of FAQs DDTC published that I wanted to highlight and kind of go over some of the nuances, because hopefully this will answer some of the questions. I'm seeing a couple of these questions will be answered here that folks are asking already just by reviewing some of these FAQs. So first, regarding TAAs, so technical data can be retransferred or re-exported for the purposes described in the OJELs, even if it was originally exported under the authority of a TAA that remains active. So that's a big use and utility right there for each OJEL. You don't have to come back and get a new TAA or revise it or amend the TAA. You can use an active TAA and you can use the OJELs to transfer or re-export technical data that was originally exported under a TAA. Second, for the value limitations set in both OJELs, the value of the defense article is determined by the original acquisition cost. Or if the acquisition cost was nominal because you have some deal between affiliates or some other kind of deal that makes the acquisition cost nominal, then you should use the fair market value of the defense article without supplementary costs such as packing and freight This is pretty similar to the valuation requirements under the foreign trade regulations, but it's pretty clear there by looking at the foreign trade regulations as well as our FAQs about how folks should deal with valuations. Third, it's important to note that neither OJEL allows for the transfer of defense articles to the United States. The retransfer or re-export must be in Australia, Canada, or the United Kingdom. Fourth, on a similar note, neither OJEL can be used to export defense articles from the United States. Open General License number 1 can only be used for retransfers, and Open General License number 2 can only be used for re-exports. So if you're crossing the US border utilizing either OJEL, you're doing something wrong. These are only for authorizing retransfers and re-exports. You should not be crossing the US border, just to make that clear. And regarding technical data, we talked about this, but just to note again, as noted, the ITAR provides relevant definitions of organizational level, intermediate level, and depot level maintenance at ITAR 120.45. So if you're not sure about what type of technical data you can use, or what type of technical data can be transferred under either Open General License, take a look at that definition, and that's the answer right there. Further, a second note regarding tech data. Tech data may only be retransferred or re-exported under either OJEL for use in the direct provision of services for maintenance, repair, or storage of a defense article. In other words, technical data can't be transferred for the purposes of procuring future services. It's got to be specifically for the direct provision of those services as defined in ITAR 120.45. Sixth, regarding the Australia and United Kingdom, in regards to the legal entities and the approved communities under the Australian and United Kingdom approved communities, only the legal entity enrolled in the approved community may receive defense articles under either OJEL. Other legal entities, including affiliates and parent entities, must enroll separately in the approved community to receive or to receive or re-export, that is, defense articles under the OJELs. So make sure when you're retransferring or re-exporting to specific legal entities that are enrolled in the approved community, just make sure it's the same one that's actually enrolled and not a separate legal entity. However, please note, so all locations of a particular legal entity may enrolled in approved communities may receive the defense article under either OJEL. So if one legal entity has 5 different facilities, all of those facilities can receive defense articles under the OJELs. So take a look at that. That's a difference between the current approved community system and the one that's in terms of eligible recipients under the OJEL. So another big benefit in terms of increasing the utility of folks joining either of the approved communities. Seventh, in terms of how to confirm whether the intended recipient of a defense article is a member of an approved community, this can be done using DDTC's DEX online system, specifically the Treaty Reference System in DEX. So for background, for those that aren't aware, approved community members are assigned an ID number, which can be provided to those who plan to use the OJEL to facilitate a transfer to get confirmation in TRS that the recipient is indeed a member of an approved community. There is a separate online search tool, which is available to identify persons registered in the Canadian Controlled Goods Program, which is maintained by the Government of Canada. But for the Australian and UK communities, go ahead, take a look at DEX, the Treaty Reference System in DEX, and you can actually take a look and see and confirm whether folks are indeed enrolled in either other approved community. So what does that all mean, just to kind of illustrate that? So if you want to use the OJELs, you would let the end recipient know that you're going to be using the OJELs to facilitate the re-export or retransfer at issue, and you would notify them, hey, can you confirm that you're part of the approved community? And they would say yes, and they would provide you their approved community ID number, and then you can go into DEX and confirm that that approved community ID number is indeed populating in the TRS system, and that would complete your compliance requirements for that particular requirement under the OGELs. So hopefully that helps illustrate that particular FAQ and how folks can go about making sure that the end recipients of defense articles using the OGELs as the license can ensure that they're using it properly. Okay, and finally, regarding DCNs and TCNs, and when I say DCNs and TCNs, I'm talking about dual country nationals and third country nationals. So please note that a separate license or other approval is required to transfer defense articles to dual or third country nationals who are not nationals of Australia, Canada, or the UK. If a particular company receives a defense article via an OGEL. So I'm thinking about 126.18 as a possible avenue to facilitate that specific transfer, or coming back to DC for a separate license for that particular dual country national or third country national. But just something you want to keep in mind if you're a company receiving defense articles generally and using the OGEL specifically in this case. Next slide. Okay, so now that we've gone over all the requirements, limitations, and provisos, the statutory regulatory foundation, and kind of gone through the nuances that are provided in the FAQs, we have 4 scenarios here that I'm going to walk through in terms of some of the questions you should ask yourself before making a determination of whether either OGEL number 1 or OGEL number 2 can be used to facilitate a retransfer or a re-export. Apologies in advance, I am going to read the scenarios verbatim for the purposes of this exercise, but then, like I said, we'll go through some of the questions you should ask yourself when looking at a specific scenario. So here in scenario 1, we have an Australian naval vessel with incorporated US origin defense articles that needs to undergo a complete refit and overhaul at an Australian contractor's dockyard facilities. However, that contractor is not a licensee or a sub-licensee on the TAA and the related DSP-5s in furtherance of the TAA for the export of the U.S. origin defense articles. The question being, you're the compliance officer, can the Australian government use Open General License number 1 as a license to facilitate such a transfer? Well, the answer is, and some of you may like this one, it depends. That's the answer. But what does the analysis look like? What are some of the questions that you have to ask yourself? Well, here for this particular scenario, obviously you'd walk through every single requirement, limitation, and proviso to make sure they all apply. But some of the big ones that stick out to me here for this particular scenario is making sure that the contractor is a member of the Australian approved community. So going through that confirmation process that I talked about of asking them for their approved community ID number, going into the DEX system, TRS, Treaty Reference System, and DEX to make sure that that approved community ID number is indeed valid. So that's like the first primary question I would ask myself. The second one is, was the defense article originally exported from the United States pursuant to a license or other approval issued by DATC? Was it DCS or was it FMS? And making sure there's original section ACA section 38 license or other approval to facilitate that export. The third question is, will the refit and overhaul they're talking about here amount to repair, maintenance, modification, or processing of a missile, UAV, space launch vehicle, item listed on the MTCR Annex, or item listed as MT in the USML? So making sure we're adhering to our MTCR obligations. I'd also make sure that the value thresholds that are specified in both OGELs are not being met, that it's going to be underneath that specific value threshold. It also makes sure, and I think the answer to this question would be obviously yes, but make sure that the retransfer is taking place wholly within the physical territory of Australia, which again here doesn't seem to be a big issue. And then finally, making sure and determining who the end use is for, and making sure that's one of the approved end uses as specified in the OGEL that we discussed earlier. So if all these questions are answered in a manner consistent with the requirement of the OGEL, specifically OGEL number 1, and all the other requirements are met, then OGEL number 1 can be used to facilitate the retransfer without having to amend the original TAA. Again, big utility, not having to come back and amend the TAA. Next slide. Okay, so same scenario here as the previous one, except this time we have a Canadian naval vessel with incorporated U.S. origin defense articles. And the question being, can the Canadian government use Open General License number 2 as a license to facilitate such a transfer? Again, the answer is it depends. You have to go through that same analysis. The primary questions here are going to be a slight variation regarding making sure the re-export is taking place wholly within or between the physical territory of Australia, Canada, or the United Kingdom. And 2, that expanded end use requirement in OJL number 2 to allow for US government end use. So those are the 2 types of kind of variations that kind of stick out to me here regarding this particular scenario. Thus, very similar to scenario 1, if all the relevant primary questions are answered in a manner consistent with the requirements of OJL number 2, and all the other requirements are met, then Open General License number 2 can be used to facilitate this re-export without having to amend the original TAA. One additional note that is important to keep in mind with this particular scenario regarding the refit and overhaul is making sure that any technical data that's being retransferred does not cover enhancing the basic performance or capability of the defense article in question. Remember that the tech data that can be transferred goes back to those definitions of organizational level, intermediate level, or depot level maintenance, repair, or storage as defined in the ITAR. And that does not include enhancing the basic performance or capability of the defense article in question. So kind of a basic ITAR kind of thing to keep in mind when we're talking about tech data and what we're using with the tech data for when transferring under the OJLs and just more generally in a broader sense. Next slide. All right, so scenario 3, again, reading verbatim, apologies, but here the Australian government would like to consolidate their warehousing and logistical requirements under one team of contractors. The contractors would be required to store and deliver equipment that includes U.S. origin defense articles. However, not all of the contractors are listed as licensees or sub-licensees on the relevant TAAs and DSP-5s by which the Australian government originally received the U.S. origin defense articles. Question here is, can the Australian government use Open General License number 1 as a license to facilitate such a transfer, or do they have to come back and amend the relevant TAAs? All right, so same answer, it depends, right? But the key questions in terms of when you do your analysis, what you should look at should be, 1, are all the contractors that we're talking about here members of the Australian approved community? Were all the defense articles originally exported from the United States pursuant to a license or other approval issued by DDTC? Or are there some FMS-related defense articles that are commingled in that particular grouping of defense articles that they're talking about here? So making sure that they have separated out DCS and FMS, I think would probably be a key compliance action to take with regard to using the OJL in this scenario. Obviously here we're talking about lots of defense articles, so a key question may be is, will the value thresholds be met? Another question will be asked is, will the retransfer take place wholly within the physical territory of Australia? And who the end use is for here in this particular scenario. So again, and this is the same language I'm going to say again for the third time, but if all the primary questions are answered in a manner consistent with the requirements of OJL number 1, and all the other requirements are met, then Open General License number 1 can be used to facilitate the retransfer without having to amend the original TAA. I would also emphasize another key requirement here that might arise in this scenario is that the OJLs cannot be used to deliver to locations outside Australia, Canada, or the United Kingdom. I think everyone's got that down, but just to reemphasize that particular point. Next slide. All right, so this is the last scenario. Thanks for bearing with me. So here we have Company A U.S. company exported defense articles, both hardware and technical data via a TAA and DSP-5 and furtherance of that TAA to an Australian company located in Australia, Company B, specifically for the integration into a larger Australian platform. 1 year later, Company B would like to sell the Australian platform, including the US origin hardware integrated within it, to UK Company C. Can company B rely on Open General License number 2 as a license or other approval to facilitate such a transfer? All right, so what are the primary questions we have to ask ourselves here? One, is UK company C a member of the UK community? Two, would the Australian platform be for UK government end use or any of the other relevant government end uses? How much does the US origin defense article, which was incorporated into that larger platform, cost? Making sure it doesn't pass that value threshold. And so here, if all those primary questions are answered in a manner consistent with the requirements of Open General License number 2, and all the other requirements are met, then Open General License number 2 can be used to facilitate the re-export without having to come back and amend the original TAA. So hopefully those scenarios are helpful in terms of illustrating some of the scenarios that DTC was thinking about when putting together this Open General License pilot program, and some of the steps that one should take when analyzing a particular transaction if the OGL would be good to use to facilitate that particular re-export or retransfer. Next slide. Okay, so moving on to ITAR reorganization. Next slide, please. So in terms of the issue, so as many folks on this call may recall, the principal regulatory efforts during ECR or export control reform was really focused on revising United States emissions lists. However, issues remained elsewhere throughout the ITAR. Specifically, really after years of narrowly scoped and topic-centric revisions, there were a couple of issues, including scattered statements of policy and definitions, including multiple sections containing the same or similar definitions, not specifically limited to a section. There are inconsistencies, contradictions, gaps, and overlaps, which can result in unclear and ambiguous guidance when folks are coming in for advisory opinions or folks are asking the response team for particular answers to questions. So taken together, these issues really, from our perspective, slow new regulatory efforts when the ITAR needs to be checked and revised for ancillary issues or differing policy approaches and interpretations elsewhere in the regulations, really many of which were updated many years ago. So really solving all these issues taken together are really causing extraneous issues that hopefully are going to be resolved through this particular effort. Next slide. So besides for complicating new regulatory efforts, the current regulatory state of play also has impacts for you, the regulatory community, within the United States government and our foreign partners. First, and this maybe will be no surprise, DTC has received consistent feedback from industry that points to a need to clarify ambiguities in the regulation. Second, and more frankly, the issues I mentioned earlier makes it hard for the department to draft new regulations and provide guidance on the current regulations. Third, the regulation's opaque presentation can and has generated uncertainty about how the ITAR applies in different scenarios to the broader interagency and also to U.S. government activities. And then fourth, partner governments and foreign industries sometimes have a difficult time understanding their obligations under the ITAR. So altogether, this is really what the impact of the current regulatory state of play is causing for not only the U.S. regulatory community, the United States government, but also our foreign partners and allies. Next slide. So in response to these challenges, DTC has been working on a series of rules that will be published in a deliberate and specific order for an extended period designed to improve the structural logic and flow of the ITAR, to make it more intuitive and linear, to resolve existing administrative and substantive ITAR flaws while minimizing potential for future issues, eliminating inconsistencies in terminologies, inconsistencies between regulatory texts and information collections, typographical errors and outdated terminology, standardizing structure and style of related sections, consolidating and standardizing licensing and exemption sections, and reviewing and revalidating content in various parts of the ITAR to make sure that it's still applicable. Next slide. So that's the pie in the sky dream. That's the goal. What are the actual individual steps that DTC is taking to actually accomplish that goal? So with all that in mind, after years of development and interagency coordination, the first rule, as I'm sure you all know, was published in March 2020 with an effective date of September 6th. And comments for that particular rule were accepted until May 9th, 2020. And so as you may have seen, this first rule was published as an interim final rule, and it restructures ITAR Part 120 to better organize definitions previously found throughout the ITAR. It consolidates provisions that provide background information or apply throughout the regulation. It adds general statements of existing policies and procedures, and makes clarifying revisions to existing text. Importantly, this first rule made no major substantive changes to the text of definitions. Really, it's just rearranging things in terms of making sure that it's increasing the logical flow of the regulations. So note that the Part 120 of the ITAR is now divided into 3 subparts intended to provide the reader with a roadmap for the regulations, similar to what the EAR does, the Export Administration Regulations. So subpart A is general information, which consolidates and explains the legislative authority and purpose of the regulations to really aid in the understanding of their importance and their source. Subpart B is general policies and processes, And to no surprise, subpart B outlines the general processes and policies of the ITAR. Subpart C is definitions, and it provides a consolidated list of defined terms that are applicable throughout the ITAR instead of having them scattered throughout the regulations. So DDTC has published a significant amount of information and guidance about these changes on the DDTC website, including a summary of changes to the ITAR, a table of moves, edits, removals, and additions, and my favorite is a track change redline version of the ITAR to specifically show what changes are already made or what changes were made as of September 6th. I would note that that redline version of the ITAR DDTC published includes the explanations provided in the rulemaking preamble as a footnote to the relevant text in the document itself. In other words, if you're trying to figure out the reasoning behind some of the edits or where the particular text has been moved to, you can take a look at the footnotes in the documents and the track change comments on the side. So really, this first rule is a proof of concept rule to demonstrate the benefits of improved organization of regulations. Subsequently, DDTC expects that more rules making substantive changes will be published periodically. Specifically, the next line of efforts will probably focus on parts 123, 124, and 125. You can expect to see the consolidation of all exemptions into one part and making changes to facilitate moving each USML category into its own section of the ITAR to really increase the practitioner's ability to navigate the USML in the ECFR, which is the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. So the drafting process for this subsequent rule is underway, and DDTC has already received input from the Defense Trade Advisory Group to inform the drafting process from the industry perspective. Other more specific lines of effort that will be subsequently include a more linear articulation of the licensing process and requirements, including hopefully trying to incorporate some of the agreements guidelines into the regulations. An update to the regulations focusing on compliance-related elements such as registration and violations provisions. And finally, possibly a brokering update, Part 129. We'll see what happens, but that's the general idea in terms of subsequent next steps. Next slide. So what do we currently expect the ITAR to look like at the end of this process? Well, this slide really lays out the overall construct. As you can see, general information and global definitions will be found in Part 120, all the exemptions in Part 125, and all the specific country policies in Part 126. So really accomplishing that goal that we discussed earlier in this presentation in terms of making sure that the ITAR is a little bit user-friendly to navigate and use. Next slide. So what are the opportunities besides for everything I just listed after this multi-phase initiative? So I talked about incorporating aspects of the agreement guidelines into the regulations. It will also allow for future revisions to be grouped in the regulations with other like content, having consistency in word choice and phrasing requirements. Also, using the public comment process for each of the subsequent following rules to hear from the broader regulated community on the impact that this reorg is having, any ideas that folks may have in terms of other changes that can be made. So really using that APA public notice and comment process to really hear from the regulated community. Next slide. So that was ITAR reorg. These are now some other unrelated ITAR reorg rulemaking that DDTC is currently working on. So yes, DDTC is working on a lot of different rulemaking initiatives on top of ITAR reorg and the OGELs. First, you can probably expect to see some revisions to the exempt technologies list in supplement number 1 to part 126, hopefully before the end of the year. Second, you can expect to see an expansion of 120.54 to include additional scenarios to which ITAR jurisdiction does not extend, again, hopefully by the end of the year. Third, you can expect to see a rule cleaning up 123.9, really clarifying re-export, retransfer language, and disaggregating destination control statements and the NATO exemption. Finally, of course, DDTC is also always working to make updates to the United States munitions list, the USML, to ensure that the standard regarding the described articles and activities remain the same, that they provide a critical military or intelligence advantage. So to that end, DDTC is actively coordinating updates relating to emerging technologies, USML Category 4, USML Category 15, and USML Category 11. So besides for ITAR reorg, besides for OGELs, these are kind of the other primary points in terms of the regulatory working environment that DDTC is working to implement. Slide. And so this was the reference material I was talking about at the beginning. So if you're looking for any of the open general license information, including the fact sheet or the FAQs or the Federal Register notice, you can take a look at those links. I've also added links to the ITAR reorganization summary of changes, that the table of moves, edits, and removals and additions, as well as the ITAR red line track change document, which is super helpful. So if folks have questions, I definitely would recommend they take a look at those particular reference materials. And of course, you can always reach out to DDTC with the response team or the advisory opinion process to get any other questions answered on top of the Q&A that I think we're about to do. So Charlie, over to you.
All righty. Well, we're only going to give you a little bit of a break, Delon. I mean, you covered a lot in that block of time here, so we'll give you a little chance to breathe and answer some initial simple overall questions. We've seen people posting a couple of common questions here, and then we'll dive into some deeper stuff, Delon. But first things first, I just want to make sure everyone knows that we want to hear what you guys thought of the information presented in this webinar. So specifically, there is a feedback survey run by Census that they would love to get your responses to what was presented today, anything you would like to see different. So if you have a second now, we've got a couple minutes before the session ends, even while we're going through a few questions here. Please feel free to go through that survey and give us your feedback. Also, in the same vein, there's a lot of information that Delon covered today, a lot of detailed, in-depth information. So we'll spend a couple minutes here talking about where you can find that after this presentation. So Renee, the first question I think we always want to remind people of is what you talked about at the beginning is where do folks go to find this presentation once it's done and recorded and all set up?
Sure, thanks, Charlie. So the presentation slides and the recording will be both on the U.S. Census webinars webpage, which I believe Lisa has been posting in the chat. So there's the link there, and also it will be on DDTC's public website. We'll send out or we'll post an announcement with the slides and also the recording linking you to the Census webinar, Census Bureau webpage.
Mm-hmm. And again, just as a reminder, folks, the recording does take a little bit. We want to make sure we get all of the specs set up on that correctly. We want to make sure we get our closed captioning recorded right. We want to make sure we, spell our names correctly. So it does take a little bit to get that recording out, but it should be out within a week or so after this presentation concludes. So you won't see it immediately after, but give us a couple of days and we'll get it out there. And again, please make sure, we know we've had lots of folks, this is a very popular topic. So if you have any coworkers, friends, colleagues that were interested in joining and that weren't able to join us today, please make sure they are aware that these recordings and the slide decks will be available. They are welcome to peruse those at their leisure. The other thing I always want to mention then is if there are questions that you have that we are not going to be able to get to today, and I can tell based on the amount that we've got here even just in the last few minutes, we're not going to get to them all. You guys are asking some good stuff here. Please make sure you take use of the self-help tools on the website. A lot of the links that Delon has provided within the presentation will provide a lot of those answers, the frequently asked questions on the website. And then please take advantage, if you do not find the answer you're looking for there, use the help offer features to request advice from the response team that Delon mentioned earlier. They will, if they cannot help you directly, they will direct you to the experts on our side that will get you that answer that you need to make you successful in this process. So lots of resources out there for you to use. So, okay, Delon, I think we've only got time for a couple of them here, but you ready to try to tackle a few of these questions?
Yeah, of course, go for it.
Okay. So the one that I want to ask, I think this is just an overall OGL question, and I just appreciate it asking it because I asked it too. So it's called a license, the OGLs, but it seems to work like an exemption. So do we actually need to apply to DDTC for permission to use the OGL, or do we just use it, ensuring all the requirements are met, and then keep the records?
It's the latter. So just you can go ahead and use it as long as the requirements, limitations, and provisos as listed in either OGL are adhered to. There should be no interactions with DDTC when using the license, or the OGL in this case, besides for going to the website, downloading the Open General license, and reading the actual requirements, limitations, and provisos. Yeah.
Right. Make sure you know what's in it before you assume you can use it. I think that's probably a good idea. And again, an excellent chance to make sure if you have questions about how to use it, make sure you reach out to the team. Delon will be one of those people who can answer those questions. And sorry, shouldn't have signed you up for that, Delon. Now you'll get a whole bunch of emails. But yes,
and so
we're here.
Just to go off that, yeah. So that's the whole point
Sure.
of the OGL, right? Is to really decrease the amount of interactions folks have to come to DDTC to ask in terms of transfers, making really a more streamlined transfer process for a set of a limited universe of transfers that DDTC is comfortable with without actually having to receive and review a particular license application. So that's kind of the whole point of the pilot program, is that you don't have to actually come to DDTC to get a license.
Right. There you go. Trying to make this easier, folks. We're trying. A couple more here, Delon. Then just in general, I'm going to ask, somebody's asking the question, does DDTC expect to make changes to the USML?
Yeah, definitely. So based on I think it was like the third to last slide. So the ones there's a couple of USML related rules that are currently in the works. One is revisions to the ETL, exempted technologies list, supplement number 1 to 126, which applies to the treaties and Canadian exemption transfers. Then the actual USML itself, folks are looking at USML category 4, USML category 15, and USML category 11 are currently the main USML categories that the technology and jurisdiction analysis team is looking at revising. I saw there was a general comment regarding dates for these proposed rules. Unfortunately, I can't give specific dates for when proposed rule or final rules or proposed rules, however they go out, when they actually go out. But for all the ones that I've listed in that particular slide, we are hoping that we can get, you should see something by the end of the year in terms of something on the Federal Register for those rules listed. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
As with a lot of this, right? That's what we're trying to go for. All right, and then just as another general question, Delon, I guess. So there's a question specifically about a Federal Register posting of the final reorganization rule. Specifically, the person asked, it was DDC published the rule in the Register in early September, but then withdrew the rule. And they're asking, will the final reorganization rule be resubmitted into the Federal Register? I wasn't sure that what we wanted to clarify anything there about it being submitted or then retracted.
Yeah, I mean, what I'll say about that is that so the rule went effective September 6th. DVTC is working on a final rule that will be published in the Federal Register itself. That will finalize it. There's going to be 1 or 2 minor changes. I think there was a typo in the March 2022 rule, and there was like 1 other minor reference. But there's not going to be major changes between the March 2020 rule and the final rule, and that will hopefully be published within, well, I don't want to specify a particular time, but DVC is working on a rule right now to do that. So yeah, that's all I'll say about that.
Okay, so it's coming. It is.
Yep, it's coming.
It will be visible very soon. Okay, and then this is just as the last one. I think I just love this because I know we're going to be spot on with these details. We just had a question. How long will the ITAR reorg take?
That's a great question. I mean,
wouldn't that just be
if I
great?
was a betting man, and I'm not a betting man, I would. I'm just going to stop there. I can't give you a time. It's a multi-year process. In all seriousness, it's a multi-phase, multi-year process similar to what happened with ECR and the USML. Really want to make sure we get this right. Really want to make sure we're hearing from the regulated community to make sure that we're making changes that benefits everyone, increases the use of the ITAR. So I think it's going to be a long time, but I think everyone will be very happy by the end of it. So yeah.
So hang in there, everyone. Thank you for your patience, and you will see changes, and obviously we will do as best we can to announce all of the changes as they come along, and make sure that everybody is aware through the postings, through the announcements on the website, so that everyone knows what changes are happening when, and what the timeline, at least in the near future, will be. So we'll keep everybody as aware as we can. And with that, I think we have to wrap this one up. So I know there are a lot of other questions out there. Again, apologies to everybody whose question we did not get to. But again, if you are still interested in finding that information, again, we will reference you back to the website, back to these slides for that information. And again, make use of our friendly folks in the response team and the other folks in Delon's office. Michael, I think that's all we've got for today.
Okay, thank you. And once again, thank you for your participation in today's webinar. Special thanks to the team of speakers, staff managing the chat, and who provided support to this webinar for sharing valuable information on the Open General License Pilot Program, the ITAR reorganization effort, and other upcoming ITAR regulatory changes. Thanks to all of the businesses that were able to join today as well. Please visit the website for future outreach events at the link provided in the chat. And please remember to complete the short evaluation as you exit the webinar, as your feedback is important to us and assists in planning future webinar content. If there are no additional questions, this completes the webinar for today. Thank you for joining, and please be safe.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for your participation. You may disconnect at this time.